This is Martin Ose from Cresa, Corporate Real Estate Advisors. This video is part of a series called Cresa Cares, which we've put together with friends of ours from a variety of different industries, including HR, finance, construction, manufacturing, legal, and of course our own expertise, which is project management and corporate real estate. The content in these videos will help your firm survive COVID-19 and ultimately emerge positioned for success. Thank you for joining us on Cresa Cares. Jamie, thank you very much for joining us on Cresa Cares. This is great. For those of you who don't know Jamie, he's the managing principal of Cresa Toronto's office, biggest office in Canada, peopled with many intelligent brokers. And Jamie's going to be on today explaining some of the ins and outs that we know about the recently announced federal government program pertaining to commercial tenants getting some support from with regard to their rent. So Jamie, in a nutshell, high level, what do you think of this thing?
I think it's a start. It's nice that we've got a program. I think that there will be some tenants who will be able to take advantage of it, but unfortunately, I do not believe it's going to be enough.
What are the mechanics of the financial support that's being offered? How much and who's contributing?
Yeah, so in principle, for those who qualify for this program and for landlords who agree to follow through with the program, net, you're going to see the rental obligation split between the tenant paying 25%, the landlord basically taking a loss of 25%, as 50% of the rent is going to be covered by the assistance program in the middle.
Do you see a lot of landlords willingly sign up for a 25% loss on rent that's been contracted?
You know, I guess it really comes down to what is the next best alternative and how they view the long-term relationship between themselves and the tenant for the long term. And then I think it comes down to a myriad of other factors, such as the financing on the building, the governance structure the landlord's dealing with, and once again, whether or not the program will qualify for them relative to the types of tenants they have.
Let's go down that hole. So what does a tenant or a landlord, or I guess both, what has to be done for someone to qualify for this support?
Yeah, step one is to determine whether or not you as a tenant would qualify for this program. And there's still a lack of clarity in terms of how we're going to calculate this, but as it has been presented so far, you're supposed to be a small business. Now, CRA defines a small business as less than 100 employees. It hasn't specifically said that, but there may be a question about whether or not if you have more than 100 employees, whether or not you will qualify. That's number one. Number two is, do you pay gross rent of less than $50,000 per month? Now, gross rent, there's many different ways that one would calculate gross rent. And so if you're paying $10,000 a month, it's pretty clear you're under the threshold. If you're paying $100,000 a month, no question you'll be above the threshold. But what happens if you're in the middle? What part of your taxes and operating costs are part of your gross rent? Are your leasehold improvement allowances that are being amortized in your deal, should those count towards that? So there may be a little bit of gray area in between relative to how you calculate the gross rent calculation. And then last but not least, your revenues have to have been significantly impacted. There's two ways to calculate this, but either month over month, so April of 2020 has to be 70% less than where you were April of 2019, same for May and same for June, or the average revenues that you had for the month of January and February effectively become your benchmark, and your revenues have to have dropped by 70% from that average number. Then when you bring in the nuances of accrual accounting versus cash accounting, once again, you have a little bit of a gray area in terms of how you do that calculation and whether or not you do or you don't qualify.
Well, I guess, and then I'll just add, I think of ourselves, we're a small company, no question, Cresa Ottawa. The impact for COVID for us, the revenue impact for what's happening last month, this month, and in May, that impact is not going to be seen for another 6 months. So, I find that interesting. It's almost I can see in a commercial setting or an office setting, that's a really hard thing to measure, is the revenue dropping. Because nobody really knows what the impact is in revenue for 90 days after the disaster happens. So, I mean, to me, this sounds like it's a program for retailers.
Yeah, no doubt it raises the question of why and how is this program developed? Yes, you would think, and there's been a pretty grand debate of who should get the assistance. Is it the organizations who have the highest level of need, or the ones who have seen their revenue shut off the quickest and the fastest, in most cases being the retailers? Or are landlords going to be more desiring to help bigger organizations that are more solvent, who can withstand the storm, basically backing tenants who are going to survive at the end of this? I do agree with you. I think most office tenants and industrial tenants will not feel the pain until months from now, arguably and hopefully when we're allowed to start going back and using our offices, is exactly when we're going to have a dispersion between our costs and our revenues catching up to one another.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
I think, Martin, it's also important to acknowledge that this program is being run through CMHC, and there's some confusion as whether or not a landlord qualifies by only having a mortgage on their property. And so that to me also shows the beginning of an indication that this program being administered by the landlords is not only there to help the tenant, but it's also there to help the landlord with the hopes that they won't be defaulting on their mortgages as they go through this as well. So I just find it very interesting. It has a net benefit, we hope, to help the tenant, but I don't think the program was truly designed just to help the tenant with their rents, but to keep the whole infrastructure, both landlord-tenant relationship and the mortgage markets, a little bit more whole than they would be if we saw lots of tenants going into a default situation.
Okay, well, if another question, we start sort of looking at how this could roll out in practical terms. If I'm a tenant and my landlord doesn't really want to forego 25% rent, they say, that's okay, I'm going to keep going with the current rent structure, I'm not going to participate in the program. Can the tenant turn around and say, I'll tell you what, Mr. Landlord, instead of me paying 25% of the rent and you losing 25% while the federal folks kick in 50%, how about I pay the full 50%? So you're whole at the end of this, Mr. Landlord, and the federal government is going to pick up the other 50%. If I'm an office tenant, or if I'm a tenant who's in trouble and I can't convince my landlord to participate in the program the way it's been laid out, is that allowed?
Well, so I'd like to give you a two-part answer on that. The first is,
as long as one of them is not maybe. It depends.
Yeah. First and foremost, if you want to use the program, you have to follow this program as it's been presented. And so one of the key elements of the program is that both the landlord and tenant have to enter into an agreement together. And a part of that rent relief agreement, it has to stipulate that the tenant will not pay more than 25%. The landlord can accept less than the 25%, but for the landlord to get the money back, they cannot take more than 25%. So with your specific example, the program as written would not count.
Okay.
More realistically, however, I find that because either a tenant will not qualify or a landlord will not want to do this, this is going to be an all-out negotiation where there really aren't any rules. As long as the landlord and the tenant can come to terms on something that's better than the tenant completely not paying anymore or going into bankruptcy in some shape or form, or the landlord locking a tenant out, we have a myriad of different structures and creativity in the middle that can include deferrals, abatements, extensions, renegotiations. And I think that's where we can play an incredible role in helping create a win-win situation while protecting the tenant and advocating for the tenant first.
So if I read between the lines there, the landlord might give up 25% of the rent for the 3 months that are COVID-19, but that money ends up being structured and kind of almost recovered through a new deal or an extension or some kind of creative deal structuring that we'd help with. So in this picture, if you sort of go through the process, somebody is participating in the program. So the federal government kicks in 50%, the landlord kicks in 25%, and the tenant kicks in 25%. If the tenant goes bankrupt or decides to not pay, I understand the landlord's not permitted to evict the tenant. So what happens if the tenant doesn't do their end of the bargain?
Yeah, I believe the rent relief agreement will be an amendment to the existing lease. So if in fact the tenant goes into default, even though they've been in the program, I would say the lease will probably prevail. As we know, many leases have an escalation clause that says when the tenant goes into default, the landlord has the ability to go after their damages, which will include any of the loans that have been there. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not the landlords will at that stage try to go back and recapture the discount that's otherwise been provided. But at the end of the day, like any default situation, what's really left for the landlord will be an interesting question based on these COVID-19 times. I do think it's worth noting for a moment that the landlords, from what I've heard, aren't crazy about this program either. Not just the 25% component, but it really has put the responsibility on them to be the good guy or the bad guy. And we know that this program isn't endless. I believe the government has said that there's a certain amount of money. So what happens if we're oversubscribed? Does that mean everybody's going to get their proportionate share? There's lots of questions around, does everybody in the building automatically qualify if they meet the parameter? Or does the landlord get to pick and choose those tenants that they prefer to work with and those that they don't? So again, it's not a perfect program. As I said earlier, it's better than no program, and it's a good start. But I do believe there'll be more rather than less tenants who do not qualify. And therefore, keeping abreast with what's going to come next, we've been told to expect that there should be something on a program for medium and larger size tenants as we move forward on this.
So just going back to what you said about one of the qualifiers being that the tenant needs to be paying less than $50,000 a month in rent. So in Ottawa, actually that probably means a different thing in every market, not in Canada. But here in Ottawa, if you are paying less than $50,000 a month, you're probably in 15,000 square feet, maybe 20,000 square feet if it's a suburban location. So what's left for someone who's bigger than that? Someone who's in more than 20,000 square feet or pays more than 50,000 in rent?
Yeah, I was going to say that the challenging part here is it's not necessarily tied to how much space you lease. And if Ottawa's like any other market, with the exception of Calgary across Canada, whether or not you signed your lease in the last 2 years, or if you have a legacy lease that goes back 8 or 9 or 10 years, you might find a very different number in calculation in terms of your luck of the draw based on how you structured your lease. But with that being said, there has already been an indication that there is an additional program or programs coming. And again, the qualifiers, what they've said is, it's to help out medium-sized businesses and larger-sized businesses, which again might speak back to how CRA defines the criteria of number of employees rather than how much rent you might be paying or how large your space is. So I think we need to be careful. I think it's going to be interesting again where we may find scenarios where a small company pays too much in rent but doesn't qualify because they don't have the right number of employees to be determined as medium or large. So I think that the program hasn't been created to try to create these exclusions unnecessarily. I think as we get more and more clarity and we start being able to actually put in for these applications, I think there will be small adaptations to the definitions, making it a little bit more accessible for tenants and landlords rather than less. Again, I think the door is there for them both to walk through together in partnership. but there's still a question of whether or not the landlord and the tenant will agree to use this mechanism.
Okay, so well, just to summarize, if people are watching and thinking, what should I do? What should they do? How can they stay apprised or at least take some steps here?
Yeah, so in addition to staying up to date and having a strong advisor in their corner going through this on their behalf, we're really looking at a 4-staged approach. Number 1, get some help with you to determine if you qualify. Number 1, as a tenant. Number 2, get some support in helping to analyze and understand whether or not the landlord qualifies, and try to keep your ear to the ground as to, is the landlord supportive of the program? Are they helping others? Try to understand how they're looking at this. Again, this is a partnership, so a little bit of humanity in the conversation. The style of how you communicate becomes very important there. Number 3, so long as both the landlord and tenant do qualify, you need to bring those parties together. So it's how to nuance that, how to get everybody on board to take advantage of this partnership. And then stage 4 is going to be negotiating an appropriate rent relief agreement. I do believe landlords, when they amend one term, often look at alternative terms to also amend. I think it's important to make sure that you're getting these legal documents double checked and that nothing is finding its way in there that you don't understand or you don't want. So again, get some professional advice before you sign any document, even if the document's intended to allow you to participate in this program. And then last but not least, if you either don't qualify or your landlord doesn't want to participate, get some help and start following through on this just as you would have if this didn't exist at all. Understand your lease, understand the options, understand your best alternatives, plan for the future, and look for a strategy short of just waiting to see what happens. I think you have to not follow the herd in this. I think it doesn't matter what others are doing. You need to do what's best for your business and your operations first, and then take a strategic approach to how you deal with your real estate, especially if it still is your second or third largest monthly expense going forward.
That's great. Well, thanks, Jamie. That's that's way more than I knew. So thanks for the information.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Yeah, right on. Okay, well, thanks. Talk to you shortly.
Sounds good.
We hope this video was helpful. For further information on today's topic, or to see other Cresa Cares content, click the link. To connect with us directly, just email us. And of course, share this with anyone you think would benefit.